Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Pieter-Dirk Uys' South African play Just Like Home. So this is a really interesting anti-apartheid play. But the thing that I find really interesting about it is not necessarily its anti-apartheid politics as such, but the way that it raises questions about reality, theatricality, truth, and so on and so on. Truth and perception, and so on and so on. In these really complex meta-theatrical ways. So, the play is set in Kathy September's flat in northwest London. She is a colored woman from South Africa who's lived in the UK for 12 years, and she has decided to return to South Africa. She has these two friends that are in the play as well. There is Hector Prince, who is a white South African actor, anti-apartheid. He is in the UK as a political refugee because he was beaten by the South African army for refusing basically to brutalize black South Africans and to participate in military repression. Then there's Gupta, who is from India. He's owns or maybe just manages a restaurant called the Taj Mahal, where Kathy had worked for a long time. And he's much more sort of conservative. He's more suspicious of the white establishment, both in India, in South Africa, and in Britain. And so he's distrustful also of Hector, even though for the most part, everything that we see about Hector suggests that he is in fact committed to anti-apartheid. And then the other character who shows up basically at the end of the first act is Trevor, who is Kathy's nephew, who's fled South Africa basically to protect his family, because he is justifiably concerned that given his own anti-apartheid activities, his family will be targeted by the South African police and military. So, the thing that I find really, really fascinating about this play is the ways in which performance and theatricality are layered within the play to raise these really dynamic and interesting questions about truth, reality, performance, perception, etc., etc. The play actually starts with a meta-theatrical gesture, because Hector has gotten a role on a TV movie or a TV show, I think it's a TV movie, where he's playing an Afrikaner policeman who tortures a black terrorist suspect in South Africa, which of course happened all the time. And in the 70s and 80s, there were sort of recurring periods in which British media especially became really sort of fascinated with South Africa and with the violence and brutality that was going on underpinning apartheid there. So Hector is in this sort of role. And one of the paradoxes so we open actually with him performing this role with Kathy tied up, being and sort of playing against Kathy. So we open with this really interesting dynamic, because what we learn about Hector very quickly is that he fled South Africa because he was, in fact, tortured by the South African army, and that he is deeply anti-apartheid. And yet we open with him performing this scene of apartheid violence. And even though we find out very quickly, because at one point there's a stage direction that says he checks his script on the sofa, so we find out fairly quickly that what we're witnessing is scripted. It is staged. It's not actual torture by South African policemen. But when we initially open, when the scene initially opens, we don't know that. So we have, right from the beginning, those sort of meta-theatrical questions raised about truth and performance. And we're unsure initially whether this is truth, whether what we're seeing on stage is supposed to be an actual South African policeman torturing a terrorist suspect, or whether what we're seeing is more artificial. And so these kinds of questions come up continually. And it becomes especially interesting. It becomes especially interesting when Trevor arrives, because there's a lot of tension between Trevor and Hector. Because again, Hector is white South African. Trevor has fled South Africa because he's wanted by the apartheid authorities. Trevor has a much more revolutionary perspective. Hector has a bit of a revolutionary perspective, but a lot of it feels very sort of phantasmatic. So, like, he talks about the idea of raising a liberation army on the model of the Spanish Civil War international brigades and things like this. But it's clear that he's not actually going to do it. He is, in fact, going to stay in London and continue performing these parts as Afrikaners and police and soldiers in South Africa. Trevor, on the other hand, has been engaged in actual revolutionary activity, and he's had to be smuggled out of his country and things like this. Kathy is very reluctant to hear this. So Trevor brings sort of actuals of news from the front, as it were, and he talks about the actual experiences that that he had in South Africa and that other Black South Africans had. Kathy doesn't want to know about this. In part because I'm going to come back to the question of acting in just a second, but this is a good, important detour, because in part one of the things Kathy has done is convinced herself that South Africa has gotten better since she left, that things are more equal, and that the news and the stories that she's seen on television are these sort of gross over-dramatizations. And then Trevor arrives and basically says, no, actually, it's worse than what you're seeing on TV. What you're seeing on TV is old footage. So even though there are still riots going on, there's still violence, it's actually become much worse. But South Africa, the South African government has clamped down on media depictions of it. So there's that element. But then the Hector's acting takes on a really interesting dimension with Trevor, because at one point Kathy leaves and Hector and Trevor are there, and they're sort of running lines for Hector's performance. But Trevor takes on the role of the torturer. So we have this really interesting reversal where Trevor brings this degree of authenticity to the role that Hector simply doesn't have. And this is because for Trevor, it's coming out of lived experience. So he forces Hector to hold a box up off the ground. He invites him to sit and pulls the chair out from under him, and then he fakes putting out a cigarette on his chest. He dunks his head in a bucket of water. He threatens to blind him, and things like this. So there's all this really interesting dynamic tension as those roles get reversed, and Trevor brings this degree of lived experience that Hector doesn't have. Because even though he was punished by the South African army, Hector was never put in the same kind of position that black South Africans regularly were. And actually, the last thing I do want to say about that is we find out, almost at the very last moments of the play, Hector sort of admits, he says to Kathy, "Remember those things I said about what happened to me in the army?" And Kathy says, "The reasons why you're getting asylum here?" And Hector says, "It wasn't that terrible. Bad, yes, but not that terrible." Kathy says, "I'm glad you're here safely, Hector, and not forgotten in some prison there." So we get this admission that he wasn't tortured per se. He was penalized, he was punished, but he wasn't necessarily tortured. And again, that sort of realization is maybe brought on by the interaction with Trevor. But the other thing I want to mention about this play that I think is really interesting in terms of the question of truth and perception, Hector has a almost boundless faith in Britain as a land of freedom, a land of justice, and a land of anti-racist safety. And the play troubles this idea. It is a simplistic idea for Hector, but the play troubles this largely through the character of Gupta, who challenges this idea. We get a hint of this early in the play, which I think is a really good sort of passing reference here. They talk briefly about a curry shop that had closed, owned by a guy named Rashid. And Gupta says, and Hector asked what happened to Rashid. And Gupta says, Thatcher's Britain finally caught up with Rashid. A Safeway supermarket came and ate his curry shop up. Besides, Rashid was pining too much and went back to Uganda. So we've got that passing reference reminding us that this is Thatcher's Britain, and that comes with certain implications, including the development of a sort of small England mentality, an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK, but also the decline of restrictions on major corporate enterprises, which destroyed a lot of small businesses owned both by white English or white British people and by immigrants. But this idea of Britain as a safe harbor is really destroyed at the end of the play. Kathy has gone out again, and when she comes back in, she's helping carry Gupta, who has been beaten up by... It's not clear whether they're soccer hooligans necessarily, or whether they're just sort of skinhead racists, but the front window of his shop has been smashed where it said Taj Mahal. He's been beaten, possibly stabbed. His glasses have been broken. He's concerned that his nose is broken. And he's been sort of subject to a number of racial slurs. So we get this kink in the works in terms of Hector's belief that the UK is a welcoming anti-racist place, because we have this very dramatic experience of racialized violence against Gupta simply because he's South Asian. So again, we have all of these complex questions about what's real and what's not, what's a fantasy, what's the truth, how does perception influence reality, and things like this.